We're extremely honored today to host a trailblazer in the study of European foreign policy and foreign policy analysis, Professor Christopher Hill, who is Professor Emeritus of International Relations in the University of Cambridge. Professor Hill, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. He's also an Emeritus Fellow of Sidney Sussex College and a Senior Associate Professor at SAIS Bologna, Johns Hopkins University. He has been a Fellow of the British Academy since 2007. Professor Hill taught at the London School of Economics from 1991 to 2004, where he was the Montague Barton Professor of International Relations, and where he also chaired the International Relations Department and served as Vice Chair of the Academic Board, among other positions he held, founding also the European Foreign Policy Unit. In 2015, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of the Peloponnese in Corinth in Greece. In 2017, he was awarded the decoration of the official of the Order of Stella d'Italia for helping to develop the study of international relations in Italy. And as we all know, he's the author and editor of many, many books, around 20, I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong, and more than 100 articles and chapters. His work ranges across international relations, foreign policy analysis, British, French, and Italian foreign policy, and the EU foreign policy, with an interest also on research regarding the interaction between academics and practitioners. His most recent publications are International Relations and the European Union, 4th edition, with Michael Smith and Sophie Vanhoonacker, that was published in 2023, which, along with the previous 3 editions, successfully illustrates how the study of international relations can be linked to the study of the European Union. Another prominent book of his is The Future of British Foreign Policy, Security and Diplomacy in a World After Brexit, that was published by Polity in 2019. Another book is Foreign Policy, the 21st Century, that was published in 2016. And The National Interest in Question, Foreign Policy in Multicultural Societies, published in 2013, which addresses extremely topical questions about the interplay between foreign policy and increasingly diverse domestic societies. Several of his works are now classics in the field of European foreign policy and foreign policy analysis, as he is one of the founding figures of the study of the modern European international relations system. His 1983 edited book on national foreign policies and European political cooperation launched an entire new field of study on the role of European states in the EU's foreign policy framework. And successive editions of the book have further shaped the field, such as notably the 2011 co-edited volume with Ruben Young, National and European Foreign Policies Towards Europeanization. Professor Hill, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Haralambaki, and also to Professor Sardanidis for this kind invitation, and good evening to all friends and colleagues who are online today. It's always a pleasure to be in touch with my friends in Greece. In fact, you gave me too kind an introduction, but I couldn't quite catch whether you mentioned the fact that my book on foreign policy analysis is translated into Greek, and also, in fact, the book on multiculturalism and foreign policy is in the process of being translated into Greek, so that I hope that I have a little bit of an extra audience in Greece as a result of that. But you've asked me today to talk to the subject, what can foreign policy analysis say about Europe's current foreign policy dilemmas? And this is a tricky question to answer, in fact, and because I could talk about foreign policy analysis as a subject, I could talk about Europe's foreign policy dilemmas, but I can't do both of those in a short period of time fully. What I'm not going to do is to sort of go through all the theories of foreign policy analysis and tick the boxes of where they might be relevant, because we haven't got time. I don't think that'd be very useful. What I'm not also going to do is to spend time on systemic approaches to the problem of Europe's foreign policy dilemmas. I think that realism and structuralism and constructivism all have important dimensions to help our understanding of this problem. But the difficulty with them is even constructivism, which does have a more human dimension than, say, realism or structuralism, is that it doesn't really give us much of an ability to get to grips with the problem of choice, action, responsibility, and implementation, all of those issues which I regard as central to our understanding of politics, not just to our understanding of international politics. And I've read many sophisticated and interesting books on realism and constructivism, but often they seem to me to be flying at a very high level above the atmosphere, almost in space, and not coming down to earth enough times. On the other hand, all the experts that we read in the newspapers and the think tanks are naturally very much concerned with everyday problems, and sometimes don't take a sufficiently long view or an analytical view. We've got to combine all these things. I'm also greatly in favor of a historical understanding of where we are at the present, even if it can't give us a very clear predictive capacity on the future. Anyway, given those limitations, what I thought I would do today would be to, first of all, analyze what I think the major dilemmas are for Europe, and to ask what Europe we're talking about here, by the way. Then go on to the next logical step, which is to say, well, where does agency exist in Europe at the moment in relation to these dilemmas that we have? And then take up two, shall we say, dimensions which foreign policy analysis has illuminated among many over the now 70 years in which foreign policy analysis has existed as a subsection of international relations, more or less started by Richard Snyder, Brooke and Sapin in Princeton in the 1950s, and look at one, the problem of leadership, and two, the question of instruments, especially instruments in relation to the dilemma of Ukraine, which we all face at the moment. And then I will end, assuming I still have some time, on my overall assessment of where I think Europe stands at the moment. And I'm going to do this by sharing some slides with you. I won't simply read them out. I will use them as background for my remarks, and I have already sent them to you, Effie, so that if anybody needs to refer to them later, of course they can do. So what I shall now do is to share my screen with these slides with you. So this is my opening slides, and as you can see, it's the thunderclouds gathering over Europe. In 1914, the British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey said that the clouds were gathering, the lights were going out all over Europe, and when shall we see them lit again? Well, the lights have not gone out all over Europe today, but certainly the lights are dimming in certain places, and the clouds are gathering, and there are some serious warning signs, not just for the people under attack in Ukraine at present. So, what are these dilemmas that we face collectively? And I say you will allow me, I hope, to be still a European. I regard myself as a European, despite the fact of Brexit and Britain's exit from the European Union. But I regard myself as European in a geographical, cultural, and indeed political sense. So there are two aspects to this, two important aspects I think we need to think about. The first is that we live in an international system which is more unstable than it was before. Whether we liked it or not, and we didn't like it for the most part, the Cold War turned out to be a relatively stable system based on a balance of terror, spheres of influence, and so on. But there was, after a while, an element of predictability developed about it. After the end of the Cold War, there was the 1990s period of optimism of globalization, and in some quarters, the belief that the world was now becoming democratic and capitalist and therefore homogeneous. I didn't believe it. A lot of people didn't believe it, but it looked as if it might be at least a more peaceful and stable international system. That came to an end, obviously, with the events of 9/11 in the United States, but perhaps even before that, with an Anglo-American attack on Iraq, on the rise of Al-Qaeda in the late 1990s. And since then, we have been living in an international system which it's very difficult to describe. We can't say it's bipolar. We can't say it's multipolar. It's clear that the United States hegemony is gradually fading. And the United States is still an extremely important country, but it cannot be regarded any longer as what the French called the hyperpower, the hyperpuissance. And the United States system, created after 1945, has come under question. Indeed, the American-dominated system was partly a rule-based system, but you could argue that a rule-based system is what derives from the United Nations Charter, not just from American power. And even the idea of a rule-based system is not just a liberal system, in other words, is coming under question at the moment. So for the last 20 years, various shocks to the system have meant that we are not quite clear about what kind of world we're living in and where it's going. In recent years, the last 10 years perhaps, this has been compounded by not just the threats from the transnational forces you see in my third bullet point of terrorism, climate change, and the dangers of epidemics, which we found through COVID, but also through the rise of great power rivalries for the first time in an unpredictable way since the period before the First World War, because of the way in which there is the issue of the possible transition of power as the United States situation becomes weaker and China's rise becomes more inexorable. And indeed, as Russia, which had seemed to be a very weak country 20 years ago, is now certainly making its presence felt in the international system, and indeed engaging in a form of alliance with China, which makes one think of classic balance of power politics. And then, of course, the Middle East has once again become extremely unstable. The Middle East has been perpetually unstable, but it's had periods of peace, or at the expense of the Palestinian people, unfortunately. And now that has once again become a possible force undermining such stability as there is in the international system, while the arms control agreements, which used to hold US-Soviet relationships stable, and then US-Russian relations, have now more or less disappeared. There's only one serious arms control agreement left, which means that the world is much more at risk, quite apart from nuclear proliferation, the possibility of more countries getting nuclear weapons. The world is much more at risk of accidental nuclear war between the United States and Russia, less so China, I think. Okay, so that's one very important thing which we have to live in this system. Europe is an important part of the international system, but what can we do about it? Lenin famously said, "What is to be done?" And I'm not sure I can say what we can do about the unstable international system, except encourage a belief in obeying the international law, of trying to use diplomacy to help stabilize conflicts where they arise, of trying to engage in peacemaking, support the United Nations system and so on. But these are very general remarks, and it's not obviously a recipe for a foreign policy, a European foreign policy, except in a broad sense. But the second major dilemma is, of course, the crisis in our own region, the European security system. What can we do about that? We have to look after our own business. And I say that once again with a very general definition of who we are. I mean, I'm now, you know, however many miles away from Athens. Athens is at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. I'm sitting in a country on the edge of the North Atlantic geopolitical sphere, but we all have common interests in the European security system. And this has been thrown into great uncertainty by the actions of President Putin. We can argue about why these things have happened and the responsibility that the West, NATO, the United States, the European Union bear for allowing us to get to this point. But the fact is that Russia engaged in a border crossing activity with military force, first of all, actually, in 2008, of course, and then 2014 over with parts of Georgia and then Crimea, but much more dramatically over Ukraine. And although the wars of the Balkans were in the 1990s, were a severe threat to European stability, they did not really involve classic border crossing activities as outlawed by the United Nations Charter of 1945. As a result of this, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which Russia should be an important part, is paralyzed because and if we can't negotiate with Russia, then the OSCE itself won't work. The European neighborhood policy and area has been significantly destabilized. Areas like those I mentioned, Transnistria, Moldova, and the Caucasus, are vulnerable to further interventions or conflict between the West and Russia. And lastly, we could say that this is all happening at a time when European societies themselves are in conditions of uncertainty and instability between themselves, inter se, as you would say in Latin, but also within their countries, partly through the results of changing demographics. Migration has become a vector of change within societies. My own society was one of the early examples as a result of the end of empire and the flood of people from the empire to provide cheap labor in Britain in the 1960s. The same happened in France, and then with Germany with the Gastarbeiter from Turkey. And now almost all European societies are facing this because of pressures from the outside, but also for their own demographic difficulties, because they have aging populations and cannot replace labor, at least at the cheap price which is necessary economically to keep things going in many areas of their life. And this has led also to the problem of fundamentalist Islam within some European societies, some terrorism of dramatic and awful kinds, as in France or Spain or my own country. And in reaction, perhaps, to this has risen the determination in certain countries like Poland before the recent elections and in Hungary now under Orbán to believe in fighting back against the move towards what you might call as progressivist multiculturalism or liberal democracy, a socially conservative reaction. So we can't even be absolutely clear about what it is we're trying to secure or defend. We're looking inwards and outwards at exactly the same time, facing much bigger dilemmas than probably 10 or 15 years ago we thought we would have. And added on to this are problems of a more technical kind in the European Union in particular. So one could argue that the European Union has certain structural, what I call structural deficits, structural challenges, but also inefficiencies in its system. First of all, even without Britain, 27 countries have difficulties often in getting agreement, especially on foreign policy. I give an example there whereby we've seen that France and Germany recently had a summit but couldn't come up with anything very significant to take the EU forward. We've seen Spain, Ireland, and Norway recognizing a Palestinian state, but the other major countries not doing so. On the other hand, not all of the member states, only 22 of the member states recognize Kosovo, and Spain is not one of them. Spain recognizes Palestine, but not Kosovo. For reasons we can understand, but this means that what Stanley Hoffman once famously called the logic of diversity still acts as an obstacle towards getting a single European voice in international relations. And some people, of course, have argued for 30 years, right from the beginning of the time I studied European diplomacy, there's been discussion about putting qualified majority voting into the foreign policy sphere. And it's never really happened. It does happen. It can work through the passerelle, or it can work through on purely small matters of implementation. But on anything important, you can't have qualified majority voting while the member states still say that foreign policy is the heart of their sovereignty. And that's what, even in the United States, foreign policy is what the federal government does. And there was a shift from the 50 states, or the 12 states originally, to the central government. But that qualitative leap has not happened in Europe, and it doesn't seem to be about to happen. So you might be able to extend qualified majority voting. Personally, I think that the use of abstention is going to be the only way forward in foreign policy, that if countries could agree, as they should, they said they would in the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1997, they would agree to use abstention to not obstruct those countries that want to make a particular position, then there is some possibility of going ahead with a consensus which is not going to be stopped by a minority. But at the moment, there are individual countries that feel strongly about what they think of are their vital interests, and they're prepared to veto certain things. Then there's a question about where Europe stops. What is Europe's final border? Various academics have tried to discuss this over the years, including me, but we've never managed to make much progress on it because it's such a political and cultural question. The enlargement policy has driven on the idea of an ever-expanding final frontier to perhaps include Georgia. But in 1987, when Morocco said that it wanted to join, it was very quickly told no. And Israel sometimes says that it would like to be, it sees itself, as with the Eurovision Song Contest, as part of Europe culturally, but actually it is not going to be allowed to join the European Union. It's obviously not a possibility at the moment, but even with a peace settlement, it's difficult to imagine it. So where is it? It's just a border that expands eastward, and how far eastward does it go in that case, or southeast? So if we don't know what our border is, then problems of identity start to become a bit more difficult. You know, how far is identity about a common sense of history? Is there a religious element? You remember Huntington's division between the Catholic world and the Orthodox world, of which Greece obviously is part. And then there is also the question of north-south, of levels of development, the richer countries versus the poorer countries, and so on. In recent years, because of the migration problem, the Schengen system has almost collapsed. There have been efforts to make a common defense policy, a capability, but that has not really made the progress that was hoped for in 1998 by Blair and Chirac. There has been some progress, and I think there would probably a bit more as a result of the Ukraine crisis. But you know, the Norwegian academic Azul Todja wrote a book called Europe as a Small Power. In other words, Europe, this is a realist approach, that Europe must recognize its limits in international relations. And indeed, my own best-known article, the Capability Expectations Gap, was really in 1993 an attempt to say, well, there will always be limits to what Europe can do, and it will always disappoint people's hopes unless it is capable of seriously improving its capabilities in terms of hard power and in terms of decision-making ability. And to some extent, that's still true. Then, of course, we have the particular policy headaches, which we all know about at the moment: Ukraine, enlargement, migration, the rise in protectionism and souverainism, and as a consequence, the crisis in the international system, of which Europe, in this context, is really a major part of the crisis of multilateralism. Our international organizations themselves and the very belief in international law and international cooperation now under serious threat. Well, what are we going to do about it then, and who is going to do it? That's the question of agency. Foreign policy analysis, in my view, has as its central question the relationship between structure and agency. And how much agency does Europe have in its current circumstances over its own destiny? Well, the answer to this, I think, has to depend on the problem. And the key problem at the moment is over Ukraine. Are we able to do anything in the short run to try to save the Zelensky government and its people from defeat? Are we also able, in the long run, to maintain Ukraine as a viable sovereign state if it is going to be constantly under pressure from a hostile Russia? One could imagine some kind of peace settlement in the next 2 to 3 years, probably unsatisfactory to Ukraine. And that might involve Europe making big decisions about how much it pays for it. Indeed, Gaza might be the same thing. Has the European taxpayer got the resources in order to be able to make major contributions to the reconstruction of both Ukraine and Gaza, quite apart from the political issue of guarantees of security, of involvement in peacemaking, and so on? At the moment, it seems that we're quite far away from either even thinking about some of these issues, let alone being able to mobilize the political and financial resources to be able to do it. And yet you could argue that on European security, we don't have any choice but to assume that we have some agency, because if we don't, the only alternatives are to hand over decisions completely to Washington. And as we know, if there is a change in president again in Washington in next November, that may be an extremely risky thing to do. But even if Trump does not come back to power, it is still the whole point of the European Union is not to be totally dependent on the United States. Most Europeans regard the United States as a key ally and, broadly speaking, friendly state, but with significant qualifications. We cannot, as a serious independent group of countries, assume that the United States will act always in European interests. It won't. It will act in American interests. Sometimes these will coincide. Fortunately, in Britain at the moment, we are having ceremonies to commemorate D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, when lots of very ordinary American boys laid down their lives in order to defeat Hitler and throw back the Nazis from France and Western Europe. That is not to be forgotten. We owe the Americans that. But between 1944 and now, there have been lots of significant differences with the United States, and we have to accept that too. It's all very well saying, we can't do X or Y, but if we actually don't think about it at all, or we do nothing, that also has consequences. one of the things about foreign policy analysis, which I think is most interesting, is a focus on non-decisions. This is actually an idea which came from the political philosophers Backrack and Barrett's and Stephen Luke's, but it's nonetheless, I have tried to talk about it in my own writings. And I think non-decisions are almost always as important as real decisions. And sometimes they are decisions, deliberate decisions to do nothing, and sometimes they're just failure to decide. In other words, decision paralysis. And we arguably are in a position at the moment in Europe over Ukraine and other things of sticking our head in the sand like the ostrich and hoping that the problems will solve themselves. And the question then arises, well, if we got to try and do something, who are we and what are our distinctive interests? Who defines those distinctive interests? Because we live in a system of semi-sovereign states. I mean, the European Union, but even if we include the wider Europe of Britain and Norway and Switzerland and so on, it's absurd to assume that any individual country is completely in charge of its own destiny. They all require collaboration with other partners of various kinds. So somehow we have to think about what these collective interests are and how to define them, to say nothing of democracy and what's the role of ordinary citizens, whether pressure groups or voters or consumers, all of whom we hope has a role in all this. But on foreign policy, we have to accept we are all as individuals rather remote from the centers of decision and the ability to control the levers of power. And that brings me to the different actors that exist in this system, this multi-level system which we have in Europe at the moment. Obviously, the European Union is the main pillar of the whole thing. It's it's one of the world's great trading blocks and production blocks, and it is a pole of attraction. People still want to come and live here. Countries still want to join the European Union. So for all its weaknesses, it is nonetheless a major part of international relations and the key part of European political life. But the EU itself cannot ignore the member states, as I've tried already to suggest, and as Effie pointed out as part of my work for many years, to try and talk about the interaction between the member states and the EU. And it's an unfortunate fact that the word fascist derives from the Latin fasces, meaning a bundle of sticks, because the idea of fascism was that a bundle of sticks tied together becomes a powerful weapon, whereas the individual sticks are not strong. As I say, it's an unfortunate symbol. But the fact is that the idea of a bundle of sticks being stronger than the individual sticks is nonetheless very important. And the member states should remember that they are stronger together in many cases than they can be separately, even if they have to work through inner groups, small groups, as we could say, contact groups, like it was over the Balkans. At the same time, we have to accept that without NATO, Europe could not defend itself in a major war at the moment. Individual European countries can project military power, especially Britain and France still. Individual countries still spend a lot of money on defense, on local problems, as indeed does Greece or Turkey. But nonetheless, against a major threat as potentially exists from Russia today, NATO is at the moment indispensable, and the United States is the key to NATO, whether we like it or not. And arguably, the United States, I put this as a provocative statement, but arguably, of all the actors in European politics and security, the United States is probably the most significant. No government in Europe can ignore US policy towards itself individually and towards the continent of Europe. What can public opinion do? not very much in the short run. We've seen massive and moving demonstrations over Gaza in many countries in Europe. They have probably pushed opinion, as they've done with President Biden, into a more critical position of the Israeli government, accepting that what Israel has done in response to the action of Hamas on the 7th of October is disproportionate, but it hasn't actually shifted Israeli policy. And that's the fact of the matter. We can all engage in symbolic gestures and demonstrations on the streets, but only at the margin, and in the longer run will it manage to have an effect on something as deeply conflictual and geographically remote as what is happening in Gaza. As for Ukraine, supposedly Ukraine is part of our continent. Indeed, I was in Poland, in Krakow and Wrocław only a week or two ago, not so far from the frontier with Belarus or with Ukraine, and life goes on for most Europeans. There are many Ukrainians in Poland, which are beginning to cause certain difficulties, resentments. There are many Ukrainians in Britain with fewer problems, I think, at the moment. But otherwise, and the issue of spending on defense, of course, is becoming a most difficult one. But otherwise, it's for most people, what's going on in Ukraine is a kind of background factor. Foreign policy analysis, I think, should always be pursued in conjunction with an analysis of how international organizations work, given that most states take part in international organizations, that diplomacy in international organizations is very important. And so we need to understand what kind of foreign policy is playing out, not just within the European Union, but within the OSCE, within the Council of Europe, within the United Nations, within the World Health Organization, and so on. Foreign policy is not just a matter of bilateral relations between two important or three important states. It takes place in kind of concentric circles of activity. And the difficulty is that these international organizations can be seen as we used to see them in the 1970s with the literature on interdependence, as interlocking and creating a new cobweb of cooperation in the world, but they can also be seen as competitive and interblocking, creating problems for each other. And of course, the classic one in our own area is the difficulty of relating NATO policymaking to that of the European Union. And for many years, Turkey held up cooperation between the EU and NATO because it thought that it gave it leverage on the question of membership of the European Union. I'm already been talking for nearly 40 minutes, so I'm gonna stop in a minute. But there are these two questions I said I would say something about more particularly. The first is leadership, and the second is the instruments of policy towards Ukraine. Well, I say a leadership is a question unasked. Of course, there's a lot of stuff in the newspapers about leadership, and there's a certain amount of academic literature. But when it comes to trying to say what can we do about a problem like Ukraine or about Palestine, we know in principle that collective action is the only way forward. But then who drives that collective action? Who has the capacity to define the problem, to ensure that countries provide a coalition and that the coalition can be sustained politically? We all know that in domestic politics, the only way to achieve something is to get a powerful coalition, either within a party or cross parties, in order to reform a country. In your own country, you've had this problem in last 10 years. In Britain at the moment, we are in a situation of drift because the present government, the Conservative government, is deeply divided between the technocrats and the right-wing culture warriors. And as a result, Britain has been unable to be an effective actor in a lot of different areas of its life, quite apart from the fact of having left the European Union, which was, I would say, a sine qua non, a precondition of effective action in the world for us. And leaders can take initiatives, but they need followers. Leadership is always about the relationship between leaders and followers. So a leader can't go too far ahead of the followers, and the followers have to accept to some degree compromises if they believe that the leader is somebody who has their own interests at heart. And you can see this in Ukraine at the moment. I'm sure there are plenty of people who have their doubts about President Zelensky, but in the conditions of crisis in which they find themselves at the moment, they haven't much option but to put their trust in his judgment, his energy, his ability to drive things forward. And they don't wish to undermine him in the face of the outside world, let alone before President Putin. So they stick together. It's easier to stick together in wartime. In peacetime, it's much more difficult. But you could argue the rest of us are now in a situation of demi-monde, a kind of grey area of half peace, half war. It helps if the leader has charisma, like Winston Churchill did for Britain in 1940. But Macron has a bit of charisma, but perhaps not outside France or even inside France these days. He certainly has more charisma than Scholz. But charisma is not enough in the European Union, because the European Union is essentially a bargaining process, a negotiation process in the European Council. And he has to be able to build that coalition, that consensus that I've talked about. Well, the European Union also, of course, has two presidents of the Commission and the Council, and a High Representative for Foreign Policy. I mean, this is in many ways a crazy way to go about things, because it makes even more difficult the problem that Henry Kissinger identified 40 years ago of who do I ring when I speak to Europe? Well, now he knows that the Americans know that they can ring High Representative Borrell, but unfortunately Borrell does not have all the power inside the European Union. He's not even elected. And of course, the presidents don't have a popular mandate. So it's only the heads of government who have some popular legitimacy. And then, of course, they're in competition with each other. All that one can think of is some kind of inner group, the bigger countries. Not something that would go down very well in Athens, if I say that. But France, Germany, Poland, Spain, Italy are the bigger countries in terms of population. Can we imagine them agreeing themselves to provide a leadership group? Or should we concentrate simply on those countries which have a special interest in the problem, like the Weimar group of France, Germany, Poland on Ukraine or something like that, or the Scandinavian countries or the Baltic countries on some specific territorial area? Maybe that's the way to do it, to have a devolved leadership on specific issues. I'm afraid my own rather pessimistic conclusion is to say that, in a way, the only hope is to build consensus quietly from below, a kind of high politics version of neo-functionalism on foreign policy, to gradually hope that you make progress on sanctions towards Russia, and therefore you might be able to make more progress on a common defense policy, or the shock of Ukraine pushes you into doing something about common European defense procurement and pushes the defense companies into a more collaborative set of activities. But the key thing is to avoid impasse, to avoid paralysis, to keep the ship moving. There's no sense of a teleology of having a final destination, but as long as the system is constantly looking to the future and attempting to confront its major problems, then there is at least some hope for taking things forward, rather than otherwise events dominate and outsiders drive events. Russia, the United States, China, and Europe cannot allow itself simply to be reactive to the activities of the other players in the international system. Well, all that is still rather abstract. But if we come to Ukraine saying, well, what instruments do we have? Let's assume that we all want to see a sovereign Ukraine restored, peace to return for the people of the area, including the Russian people, and economic prosperity to be restored. I know some people might not agree with that. Some people might say, well, Ukraine should be absorbed within Russia, but that's not my view. So that you can come back on me if you like. But let's say that's what we want to achieve. Well, we're not going to do it without NATO's deterrence power, because if NATO collapses, then the whole issue of the security of the Baltic countries and of Poland and of Moldova and Transnistria come into question. Even if Putin doesn't intend to move against those countries, they're going to feel increasingly insecure, and the chances of conflict with Russia will become much greater. So NATO deterrence is indispensable, I think, for the aim we are concerned with. And foreign policy analysis, a lot of foreign policy analysis is about the relationship between ends and means, as I'm sure you're all aware. And I could have spent time talking about incrementalism and rationality and all the difficult theoretical problems that are thrown up in relation to the ends means question, but we'll leave that. Well, the EU actually in this crisis has maintained its solidarity better than people imagine. There have been difficulties, especially deriving from Hungary, but on the whole, even President Orbán has backed off on the last issue of money towards Ukraine. There are differences, of course, about how far the EU should go in supporting Ukraine, how much money and all the rest of it. But by and large, there has been a surprising amount, given the logic of diversity, a surprising amount of consensus on all this. And the sanctions have held together. Now, of course, the sanctions have not worked. Sanctions rarely work in terms of completely changing the status quo, but they do impose costs. And if a peace settlement ever is to be considered by both sides, then the sanctions will certainly be a factor in the minds of all parties and will give the Europeans a degree of leverage. Because the EU is still the biggest single trade bloc in the world, and it does allow diversification from both Russia and China. It's also true that we have agreed in Europe to improve our defense spending. Now, admittedly, some of that was under pressure from Trump, but Ukraine has given a big boost to that idea. Of course, the Germans under Scholz immediately said they were going to spend another 100 billion euros on defense, and they were going to transform German foreign and defense policy. Unsurprisingly, that has proved to be a rather slow and reluctant process for reasons of domestic difficulties and resource difficulties. And even if we are to achieve more coherence on defense spending, it's going to be a long process. We also, if we're to do anything about Ukraine, need to ensure harmony and cohesion between the European Union and the UK. I've been dismayed about how the Johnson government was not interested in cooperation with the EU on foreign and security policy. But since the Ukraine crisis, things have started to improve. And under Prime Minister Sunak, it's got a bit better. And if Labour comes to power in next month in the elections in Britain, there will certainly be some kind of agreement between the UK and the EU on foreign and security policy. Diplomacy is also a major element of European strength in the world. 27 diplomatic systems, embassies and missions in most countries in the world, links with many different kinds of country through our own national traditions. Unfortunately, Europeans' image in the global south has been weakened as a result of the post-colonial critique, especially in those countries like Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands, which had empires in Africa and Asia, and where some pretty appalling things happened, and there was participation in the atrocities of slavery over 200 or 300 years. So the global South has actually started to become more critical of Europeans than it ever was in the 1960s and 70s, immediately after the period of decolonization, because the new generation us in southern countries, but also in people of ex-colonial origins inside countries like Britain and France, are beginning to say, we don't identify with this imperial nostalgia. We think that we need reparations for all the damage that you did to us in the past. And China has made huge progress in Africa, for example, because it has said, we don't want to give you lectures on human rights. We don't want to interfere in your countries. We'll just do economic deals with you. Whereas the Europeans still, to some extent, with their so-called normative power on human rights, have behaved in a neo-colonial way of saying that you should live up to our values, our ways of doing things. This is a very difficult set of dilemmas, obviously, if you believe in human rights. The last thing I say in what we could do, I mean, but obviously diplomacy is important to try and keep as many countries as possible in a coalition to keep pressure on Putin. But Putin and President Xi in China have been very effective in dividing Europeans and the Americans and the Ukrainians from the global South. So there is a lot of work to be done there. The one thing I think that we could do is to engage more in cyber counteroffensive towards Russia. You know, the Russians are constantly threatening us with nuclear war if we allow the Ukrainians to use weapons which hit Russia. And that is a difficult problem. But the Russians clearly are also, their secret services are constantly interfering in European societies. Even at the Champions League final the other night, there were Belarusian demonstrators with T-shirts who ran onto the pitch. This is a trivial example, but there's lots of hacking of computer systems. There's no reason why we can't make life more difficult for the Russians in return. We have the expertise to do it. Probably we are doing it. We just don't hear very much about it. It would be more serious to engage in actual subversion. There was a report recently that a number of fires in West European countries are being linked to the FSB, the Russian security services. Whether or not that would lead to retaliation inside Russia, if it were true, is another matter. I think the West has been very cautious on things like that. But anyway, whatever we do here, all these things, they're necessary, but they're not going to be sufficient in order to change things. The only things that will change things in the case of Ukraine are political determination to keep Ukraine going, military help, financial help to ensure that Ukraine can't be defeated. And at some point, both of the parties will decide that conflict exhaustion requires some kind of negotiation. Unfortunately, the people of Ukraine are smaller in numbers than those of Russia, and their situation, the long game is one that Putin has a huge advantage in. Okay, the situation for Europe, therefore, at the moment is highly challenging. I'm not going to go into this because I've talked about most of these points already. I don't think the EU is going to disintegrate, but I do think that it is in a highly defensive environment and with a limited number of instruments to play. But what could, taking policy analysis to a practical level, what might we do? And I'll just spend my last 2 minutes. I'm sorry to have gone on a bit longer, Effie, than I said I would, but I'll stop in 2 minutes. Firstly, we need to accept that we have a distinctive way of life. If we do, I mean, maybe among the 30 states of Europe, we have very many differences, but we have a lot in common as well. Most Europeans think that they don't live a life like the Americans live it, and they certainly don't live a life like the Russians or the Chinese live it. So therefore, if this way of life is distinctively European, then we should be ready to defend it, not just militarily, but also culturally and possibly by economic protectionism in certain ways, because otherwise we will certainly be divided and ruled and undermined. I think we have to therefore look inwards to some degree. We have to prioritize order in Europe and realize that spending our time trying to put the whole international system right is simply going to be counterproductive. The European Union has spent far too long lecturing other countries on how they should behave in their internal affairs. I'm a supporter of human rights, but I think that it's not good to constantly use conditionality as a way of trying to leverage other countries to change their internal affairs. I think that only soft power, that is to say, the power of example and taking a very long view, is the way to hope that things might change on those issues. Thirdly, I think that the EU federalists have to accept that the nation state is not going away. And therefore, the EU, in order to be strong, has to be, as I said, a bundle of sticks tied strongly together. It is both separate and collective at the same time. The EU is an important, a central convener of policy, a multiplier of power, and the ability to set standards on many important issues, both technical and political, like climate. And it's shown that it can do that, and it has a good record in doing that. Fourthly, we talk a lot about strategic partnerships with almost every other part of the world. At one stage, the global strategy of 2016 of the EU, and going back to 2003, talked about possible strategic partnerships with China. These are empty words, by and large. In international relations, even with the United States, our partnership outside NATO, in other words, on economic and cultural issues, has limits to it. And therefore, the Europeans have to defend their own interests, even against their friends as well as against their adversaries, and not assume that other people will pursue the same kind of values or economic criteria that we are using. Fifthly, I think we should accept, when talking to the Global South, the need to reform the international institutions. The UN Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF are all badly in need of reform, and the Europeans need to do it. There was a chance in 1990 to reform the United Nations Security Council, but Italy stopped it because it didn't want Germany to go on the Security Council. And as a result, Japan couldn't go on either. So there have been lots of proposals for reforms of the Security Council. They have always been blocked, not just by the Europeans, I have to say, because often the Africans can't decide on who will represent Africa, or the Latin Americans can't decide who will represent Latin America. But certainly we should push reform of international institutions if multilateralism is to survive. Sixthly, Europeans should accept that we have a demographic crisis and not simply talk in terms of defending white Europe against the threat from Africa and Asia. We need migrants in order to continue to have healthy societies where all the range of different jobs are done. It's perfectly sensible, however, to say that if people come to work in Europe, then they should accept the existing culture, that they should integrate into that culture, and that change only takes place gradually. Nobody can expect special treatment. And as in my country, unfortunately, is the case, sometimes having a kind of a special ethnic group to themselves, not very well integrated into wider society. But lastly, democracy requires that in the modern world that we do all have multiple identities. We're Greek, European, global. We might have a particular religious identity. We might be Athenian as opposed to coming from Crete. this is inevitable, and it's a good thing, and it enables us to be internationalist. But in order to be internationalist, we have to accept also that we have roots, and those roots in this case are European and national in the first instance. So I hope that I have at least shown that foreign policy analysis can deconstruct the problems and to some extent construct sensible, clear thinking about what can be done and what can't be done. But I perfectly understand that there is no single solution to many of the great problems that we currently face. And I look forward to hearing your own views on these matters.
Professor Hill, thank you so much for this timely lecture, considering that in a couple of days, Europeans are called to vote in order to take a stance on domestic and transnational issues, as you mentioned. We only have 10 minutes left, so I'm opening the floor directly to questions.
I thought we were going on for half an hour. Is that not the case?
But
I thought you said until an hour and a half was the whole session.
Yes, but your lecture is more than an hour. I didn't want to interrupt.
No, understandably. I'm sorry. I thought we were going on until 30 minutes past the hour, which in your case is 19:30. Is that not the case?
Yes. Yes, I apologize because I had the timer here. Okay. We end at 7:30. Okay.
Okay, whatever time suits you. Sorry,
yes.
but I would have.
No problem. No problem. I apologize. It's my mistake because I had the timer here and I was looking backward.
Okay.
So I'm opening the floor directly to questions. I see that Professor Tsardanidis would like to comment and possibly pose some questions. Professor Tsardanidis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate Christopher Hill for this lecture, which adopted a holistic approach for all the issues and problems which EU confronts. Talking about foreign policy analysis, one of the main topics of FPA is decision-making. And we know that in the European Union, there is not, as you described, a concrete decision-making body. There are the member states, there are the institutions, there is a presidency, so on and so forth. Of course, we have to keep in mind that the European Union is not a state. It is a sui generis actor in the international system. My question, I have 2-3 points. My first point is that there is a lot of discussion about changing the decision-making process in the European Union. The federalists are coming with an idea of abandoning the consensus and the veto in foreign policy. And they have some arguments about that, given that there are other deficiencies in the European Union. You have explained very well about the capability gap, the lack of political willingness, so on and so forth. So what is your opinion about abandoning the consensus system and the veto? Abandoning the consensus system, yes, and of course abandoning veto. My second point is about the end of frontiers. You said that where the frontiers of the European Union end. I think I adopted a rather constructivist approach. The frontiers of the EU are defined by us in the final analysis. For example, Turkey is part of Europe, of course, because of Thrace. And also Kazakhstan could apply accordingly because part of Kazakhstan belongs to the Europe continent. Cyprus is not an island of Europe, it's an island of Asia. So this is, my main point is rather relative, all this about geographical frontiers, and it is rather political rather than purely geographical. And I'll stay on these 2 points, and then I could, if there is time, to come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let me be as brief as I can, given I've spoken so long. Firstly, on consensus, I think I did say that qualified majority voting is going to be pretty difficult to introduce in foreign policy. You know, there's been a lot of talk about it over the years. It's never happened in any serious way because member states would ignore it. And we've seen on various issues about money towards Ukraine or Kosovo, that they do go their own way. They have the right of defection, as we say, from a common policy. And one of the difficulties over the common policy that Europe has had on the Middle East, the belief in a two-state solution, which derives from the Venice Declaration of 1980, this actually has not led to consistent European policy in pressurizing Israel, because some countries, particularly Germany and the Netherlands, have not been willing to do it. There have been serious divisions between France and Germany and France and the Netherlands on this, or indeed between Greece and other countries. So this is, I think, inevitable. I think the only way forward is to say that the Europeans must say that a country could opt out of a common position, as we saw with the migration issue, that there was a kind of creative solution that you don't have to have a quota of migrants, but you could pay for some instead. You had different ways of contributing. But equally, you could simply say, I do not wish to vote on this in this way at the United Nations, because we hope that all the European Union states will vote the same way in the United Nations. But obviously they don't on many important issues. Sometimes even, as we saw over Iraq, France and Britain disagreed as the two permanent members of the European members of the Security Council. So I think all that can be done is to reduce the area of disagreement by saying that countries can abstain or opt out. And equally, if they really want to issue a veto, they must be prepared to do it once, twice, 3 times to be absolutely sure that this is their position. Because sometimes it's just when there's a change of government, the government might change its position on a given policy. Now, we know that Spain has not changed its policy on Kosovo because it's a very deeply difficult issue in terms of Catalonia and secession and so on. So it's seen as a major vital interest not to recognize secessionist policy. And I'm afraid that's just the fact of the matter. The second thing on frontiers, I don't think Kazakhstan is part of the European continent. I think it's part of the Eurasian landmass, which is a different matter. I mean, the difficulty is that the European continent has a very fuzzy eastern border. At the moment, the European Union thinks that all the member states of the Balkan region between Greece and Slovenia, they qualify in principle, and eventually they will join the European Union because it makes some kind of geopolitical sense. We already have Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. Ukraine, before the war, was clearly a very big problem in terms of joining the European Union. I think it still remains a very big problem for various kinds of practical reasons. In foreign policy terms, the difficult question is how far east do you extend in terms of upsetting the Russians or of simply exposing your frontier to problems which you didn't previously have? I mean, one of the issues, I don't want to get into the issue of Turkish possible membership of the EU here, but clearly if Turkey did join the European Union, the frontier of the European Union would extend into the Middle East in ways in which it currently doesn't. And so European activity would be very seriously engaged in problems which at the moment most Europeans can keep out of. So the European frontier is a mix of geography, in other words, the North Africans can't join, and politics. In other words, why we want to enlarge, because we want to stabilize the area of the neighborhood to the east. And in my view, the whole enlargement policy was not thought through properly and was done too quickly. And we are now ending up with some of the difficulties of it. But it's not for me. I'm a Brit. So it's up to you guys in the EU to decide where the frontier of the EU is.
Exactly, yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Hill. Are there any questions by the audience for Professor Hill? Please raise your hand. Yes, Mr. De Paiva.
Greetings, everybody. So thank you all, first off. I am a master's student in international relations and European studies from the University of Évora. I'm in Portugal. I'm Portuguese. And I just found it fascinating. This is not the first conference, mind you, of this institute, or I guess organized by this institute in which I've been present. But it is the first one, I believe, where I've actually met, albeit face-to-face, Professor Christopher Hill, whom I would like to congratulate for this initiative, this presentation. And even if it did last a bit longer than we had anticipated, it was quite the pleasure and quite the learning experience here. Thank you so much for that. I've got 2 points here to make. I'm not entirely sure whether they're questions or, I guess, comments regarding some of what was mentioned. So one of them is a point on going back to the Turkey and Middle East aspect, right, regarding the European Union. For context, as per my master's dissertation, I'm studying European Union activeness and its legitimacy. And then from a theoretical standpoint, I'm doing a literature review. I'm also using a governmentality approach by Michel Foucault to explore power in a bit of a different way as compared to traditional IIER theories. So you could say realism or constructivism or liberalism, etc. Well, when it comes to Turkey and the Middle East, I was just thinking about a book by Stefan Koekler and Tom Delge, which mentioned a 2014 book whose name I forgot, but it mentions briefly the aspect or the concept of relational and structural foreign policy, in the sense that, at least partially, when it comes to Turkey, the EU would have to attempt to solve problems of neighbors of the EU, right? So if the frontiers were to expand, say hypothetically, the EU's neighbors would change, at least partially. And as per the ENP, the European Neighbourhood Policy, and as per the geopolitical EU and Ian Manus's challenge as a Toronto, all of those aspects, right? The EU would kind of have to step in to try to solve the problems of neighbors in a way. So that's the comment to add on to what both professors were saying. I have got a question. I guess it's a bit broader. It's not a particularly high quality research question as of right now, but it's just something that came to me as I was listening to you, Professor, which was, I'm sure you know, you're aware of the Bretherton and Vogler study on EU activeness and legitimacy, right? You're probably aware of it. But there was also an author called Thomas Diaz, which mentioned that the EU is not particularly sui generis as an entity, in the sense that, well, according to the international school, right, or the English school, for the EU to be a, how would you call it, a sui generis entity, it would have to fundamentally transform the way international society is run in the global order, if you will. But it doesn't seem to be the case at all. So on the one hand, you've got most authors claiming that the EU is this sui generis entity, this new kind of international actor, or most of them, or several of them, like John Ruggie in his constructivist framing, right, which we kind of talked about here a bit, albeit indirectly, in the sense that, well, the EU is not a state, right? The EU is not exactly the US. or Portugal or the UK or Greece. It hasn't got a national interest because, first of all, it's not a nation to begin with. Second of all, it's not a state. And third of all the other reasons.
Sure.
But interests, how do you feel about the activist legitimacy debate? Because for us to know whether the EU is legitimate in the sense of its action, its political action, we ought to know what it is, for starters. Like, is it an international organization? Is it a supranational institution? Is it an intergovernmental grouping? Is it nothing else? What is it? Is it not an actor to begin with? Because you could say, well, according to realists, for example, and I guess more individualist cues, you could say, well, the EU is simply not an actor because it's not rational in the traditional sense, if you will. So how do you feel about the activist and legitimacy debate? How do you feel about the sui generis argument? How do you feel about all that? Sorry for rambling.
No. Well, you've raised some big and complex questions. I mean, legitimacy is obviously has an inside and outside dimension, doesn't it? So the EU is undoubtedly legitimate internally because it has a treaty base. The member states can opt out of it, as Britain did, and so on. So there's, even if the European Parliament elections mean that the parliamentarians are a bit remote from the people, nonetheless, there's no doubt about its internal legitimacy. The question of external legitimacy is the most difficult one because it is not, as you say, a state. It is, as Professor Sardanidis said, it is sui generis, but nonetheless, it is recognized by almost every other actor in the world as being an interlocuteur valable. In other words, somebody with whom you can do business, somebody has standing in international law that stands alongside the member states. So that's why the European External Action Service now effectively has embassies in many countries around the world and has status in international law and so on. Now, to go beyond that rather technical version of legitimacy, we need to go back in time because it's true that there was a hope that the EU would be a model for a new way of doing international relations. That it could be two kinds of models. It could become a United States of Europe, and then the world doesn't look like doing so in the near future. The second is to say that the European way of doing things, which is to share sovereignty, to pool sovereignty, is something which is gradually having an influence on other people in the outside world. So if you look at Africa, for example, the Organization of African Union, which was formed in the early 1960s, was based very strictly on the principle of state sovereignty because naturally these countries wanted to be independent. It was succeeded by the African Union around the turn of the millennium, which models itself on the European Union. It actually hasn't followed that model very far down the road, but who knows in the future whether the idea of Pan-Africanism might gradually emerge along the lines of Europeanism. On the other hand, if you look at ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that is still based very strictly on sovereignty and limitation on what, there's no central powerful secretariat or anything like that. So I think that the European Union has failed in the sense that it hasn't transformed the whole international system, but I think that it does represent the idea of a zone of peace, of legal relations, of pooling of sovereignty, which is respected and sometimes regarded cynically and exploited by outsiders, yes, especially the big powers. But nonetheless, it is what the Germans call, a new quality of international relations, and it's one that's lasted. That's all I want to say in the circumstance.
Can I just say that some would even regard
here.
If I may interrupt, because so that we don't have a lot of time left, so that other people can pose questions.
Right.
If it's okay with you, and then we come back to you. Thank you so much.
I'll just drop the message on the chat and
okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your understanding. I appreciate it. Dr. Cabron-Tabor, and I'm very happy to see you.
Yeah,
I have to say.
Thank you, Professor Hill. I'm very happy to be here. My question is very, very short. It's about Europe's many actors. Shouldn't we pay on this level? China as a great power, as a power that divides Europe. We can see in Central Europe, especially Hungarian attitude and all the Chinese investments in Hungary connected to electric vehicle industry, and Poland or France that wants to put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle, and Germany not so willingly to do it. Shouldn't we put on the Europe's many actors China as well? Because you haven't added China, it's only US.
No, it's true. I didn't mention China, but I would make a distinction between those actors which are actually part of the decision-making internally of the European security system. And because of NATO, I think we have to count the United States as a semi-internal actor, and not just NATO. I mean, it's often said that the Americans de facto have a seat at the Council of Foreign Ministers because everything that goes on there is leaked to the Americans in advance anyway. And that if the Europeans want to do something which is very much opposed to American interests, a negotiation takes place informally with the Americans. So, you know, whether we like it or not, the Americans sit at the table as a kind of ghost in the machine inside Europe. Now, the Chinese are players in Europe, obviously, very powerful players economically, to some extent politically. You know, they own the port of Piraeus near Athens. So, you know, we can't ignore their strategic power in this respect. But at the same time, they are not part of the system. They're kept very much out of it. And the debatedly right that China is a very important variable in all this. And in fact, one of my own arguments in my writings has always been that the European Union's biggest weakness in foreign policy is in its relations with the big powers, because including the United States, China, and Russia, because the big powers have so much better a capacity to divide and rule the Europeans than the smaller countries or other international organizations. The Europeans are quite good at sticking together over smaller countries and other regional organizations like Mercosur or whatever, but they're not so good at resisting divide et impera with Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. Until recently with Moscow. With Moscow now better, but.
Thank you, Professor Hill. If there is, I don't see any hands raised. So if there is no question by the audience, I have a question. I have several questions. Of course, I took notes, but unfortunately, I wish we had 2 hours here to discuss with you. In your work, you stress transnational diplomacy, and you also mentioned how important it is in your lecture, and how its unique structure of transnational diplomacy, of the European Union and its values shape its interactions with external partners and international institutions. And also in your work, you stress, like many foreign policy analysts, scholars, the impact of domestic politics. And we see that now in domestic politics, especially with the rise of AI, also transnationally, internationally, and in domestic politics, that public opinion is influenced by, and foreign policy as a result, by many non-state actors. And also we see how the interplay, we see this with many foreign policy scholars. For example, Robert Putnam with the two-level games. We saw it with James Rosenow in the famous 1997 book Along the Domestic Foreign Frontier, where social capital comes in the front. And they stress the importance and the impact of non-state actors. So I would like to ask you, how do you think the involvement of non-state actors in European foreign policy can affect the balance between national interests and the broader international goals, especially now with the rise of AI, and how it's going to transform the global order? Thank you.
Well, AI makes this a particularly difficult problem, and I certainly don't think I'm sufficiently well informed about AI to say how I think it's changing the actions of non-state actors or indeed of governments. But all I will say about that is that we are clearly in an extremely fast-moving environment in which probably politicians and many normal actors, NGOs, universities and so on don't quite understand what is happening and how their environment is going to be transformed. So all kinds of new possibilities come about. What I will say is that my own fear on AI is that the big players, especially the authoritarian big players who are cynically willing to use techniques of manipulation of their own population and of third-party population, are going to be able to interfere quite significantly in normal processes of democratic politics. And therefore, the only thing we can do is to be as alert as possible and to try and use our own experts to inform legal and political players so that we can constantly try and second guess what is being presented to us as truth, which is not, in fact, truth, but is an alternative reality. So I leave that on one side. I think we're all going to be seriously affected by it. Your other question about non-state actors, I mean, I think right from the start of my work on foreign policy analysis in the mid-1970s, I was influenced by Rosenau and others to believe that there was no, it was certainly not a question of a sharp division between domestic politics and foreign policy. But I didn't follow Rosenau as far as saying, actually, the frontier is going to dissolve, the state is on the way out, we are now going to be in a kind of complex global cobweb, spider's web, in which we are all enmeshed. I still think that the state is a powerful player in political life. Even small states, those people who control the state control a great deal of what ordinary people do in their life. We know the existence of borders has become more important in recent years. Anybody who's tried to cross a border without the right documents knows that the state has enormous power and managed to create the caliphate for a while. But then there are other actors which simply are happy to exist in the gaps between states that states can't control. And there are democratic non-state actors which believe in global values and want to challenge patriotism and nationalism and to overcome those classical ways of thinking about politics. So we live in a world of competing and highly varied political actors. And only if politicians don't understand that, they often make serious mistakes. So you could argue that the populists and the souverainists believe that they can simply rebuild the nation state and they don't need to worry about cooperation with anyone else. They can do it all on their own. They're going to find out that this is a very serious error economically and culturally. But it's paradoxically, they also cooperate amongst themselves. So you get the populists of Meloni and of Le Pen in France forming an alliance. You know, there are international meetings of populists, which seems to almost be a contradiction in terms. So at the same time, everybody knows that ideas, this is where the constructivist analysis is powerful, that ideas swirl across political borders. They swirl across economic protectionism and so on. They get into the heads of men and women and they change our behaviors. It sometimes takes a long time to change those behaviors, but it can lead to revolution. And we, in the 1980s, when I was a young teacher, we didn't think that religion had any place anymore in international politics. That was history, back to the 17th century in Europe and so on, or the 19th century in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire. No, bad mistake. Religion has become, once again, a very important vector of international relations. So I think, you know, I would simply say we have to have what I would call, like air traffic controllers, we have to have a constant horizon scanning capacity, looking out for new developments and trying to understand how they relate to the structures with which we're familiar.
Thank you very much. Just to note that in his turbulence theory book, he states right in the introduction that the state remains the main level of analysis. I'm talking about James Rosano.
Okay. So
yes, I just
remember having, yeah.
Yeah, but since
you're right, you're right. But I mean, his linkage politics is a slightly different line on it. And I remember having arguments with him personally at the British International Studies Conference. He was a very open-minded guy, actually, a very stimulating.
He had to resort to complexity theory in order to bridge this gap between the domestic foreign frontier. So since we are going to international we are trying to explore a little bit about international relations theory. I have one last question if there is nobody else here who would like to ask something, if you permit me.
Sure.
In your work, you say that one, and also relates to James Rosano, because his last book, the very last book that was published in 2008 was People Count. And when I pose the question, you'll understand my rationale. So in your work, you state that one of the main problems in IIER theory and practice is that the field deals with generalizations that become abstract and remote from the lives of actual people. And so my question is, and this plays an important role in foreign policy analysis. So my question is, how can we foster this necessary corrective in foreign policy analysis and the study of IIER to overcome this shortcoming without resorting necessarily to post-positivist and post-structuralist approaches and, still keeping the statist approach? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm actually methodologically quite eclectic. I mean, I'm not obviously not a post-positivist myself, but I think that we can learn, there's a chance that we can learn things from a lot of different kinds of approaches, if we've got time, because there's so much different stuff being written. But personally, I think we always have to be sensitive to both the drivers of policy and the effects of policy. So if we take migration, for example, a huge amount of writing about migration is normative in my country anyway, and perhaps in yours too. In other words, about the tragedies of individual migrants suffer. And I think that leads to both a good degree of human sympathy, but it doesn't necessarily grasp the policy question. What can be done about migration, or what should be done about migration, and at what level? Should the decision be taken at the national level, the European level, the international level, or whatever? So I think that there is a great deal of what you might call sentimentality about migration, because it's all focused at the micro level. On the other hand, if we just looked at the policy level, we would simply take decisions on big numbers. How many migrants do we need? There are so many hard cases. That's just too bad. We can't keep people. We can keep people out. We can put them in prison, in camps, whatever we like. We must always have an understanding of why people are migrating, who is migrating, and also what are the consequences for people in the countries to which they are coming. And of course, there is a powerful distinction to be made between economic migrants and people fleeing oppression, although that distinction is not always easy to make. So ideally, when dealing with the problem of migration, you need both the micro level and the meso level and the macro level. That's what a true policy analyst would do. Unfortunately, there are very few people. I have tried to write myself about this. In the recent book you cited on international relations in the European Union, 4th edition, I did write about the policy dilemmas that are created for the European Union on this question. But I don't see much intelligent debate in Britain anyway. I simply see it's a debate about numbers, rather than actually what kind of society do we want to be, how many migrants could we take or should we take in a given time period. These big issues are not really discussed. And unfortunately, perhaps they don't do enough foreign policy analysis. But migration actually has only become a foreign policy issue the last 20 years. It more or less derives from the Seville summit of 2002, I think, in Europe. Previously, it was regarded as a Home Office issue, an Interior Ministry issue. Anyway, migration is only one example of the kind of point that you've asked me about.
Thank you. Do you think, on this point, do you think that maybe a model on decentering European foreign policy and decentering norms would be helpful? And this way would help Europe escape its thinking that it's the center of the world and the colonial burdens that is hiding, especially for its contacts with the global south and other parts of the world?
Sorry, what would be helpful?
Decentering European foreign policy, decentering norms, and helping the European Union to connect with other regions and other continents on another level without placing the European norms and the European culture at the center of its foreign policy approaches. Do you think that this would be more helpful?
Well, I think
a new model on that.
Yeah, I think it is helpful, but I mean, some of this work has already been done. I mean, there's Martin Holland in New Zealand who's done a lot of work with his colleagues on Asian perceptions of the European Union, and their work decenters the European Union. I mean, it doesn't underestimate the European Union, but it shows that, ironically, China takes the European Union very seriously because it wants to divide Europe from the Americans, whereas Indonesia thinks that the European Union is not really very important, and why should we bother with it? You know, they have their own problems to focus on. So that kind of perspective is extremely helpful, and I think Europeans certainly need to stop thinking that they are the center of the world. On the other hand, as I said in my last slide, I think we have every right to be not just critical of our own history, but also proud of many of the things that we have achieved. You know, I always remember the remark of the American journalist Studs Terkel, who said the pyramids are one of the greatest creations of human civilization, but we should never forget that the pyramids were not built by the pharaohs. They were built by 100,000 ordinary workers, most of whom died. You know, and that's true also probably of the Parthenon or of Windsor Castle or whatever it is. You know, we have all these great things which remind us of our culture, but they actually are also remnants of power. But that doesn't mean to say that they're not beautiful or worth taking into account as major things that we all inherit and feel that are part of ourselves, our identity. You know, Leonardo da Vinci was not my culture, but he's now a part of my culture because we are all Europeans. We all think of da Vinci as one of the great products of our system.
Okay. Professor Hill, thank you so much. We're very honored and grateful for your lecture and your time. We came to the end of the event. We truly thank you for your participation in the IIER Distinguished Virtual Lecture Series. I would also like to thank, as always, Professor Haralambos Sardanidis for supporting those initiatives, and Ms. Stella Miliotti and Mr. Dimitris Polalis, without whom the successful organization of those virtual lectures and other virtual events that my research program organizes would not have been possible. Many thanks also to the students, scholars, researchers, and other enthusiasts of international relations who have been attending our virtual lecture series. The research program lectures return in September with a very exciting lecture by distinguished Professor Ned Libo. So please stay tuned for that. We're going to announce information on the date and time. And until then, we wish you have a pleasant and adventurous summer. Thank you to all students, researchers, and scholars from Greece and around the world who have supported the initiatives of the research program on the theory and practice of international relations. We wish you all the best. Have a wonderful summer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Apologize for going on a bit long, but we did have a good discussion in the end. So thank you.
No problem. I wish we had more time. It was truly interesting. And this gives us, you know, a motivation when you come in the fall. If you come in the fall in Greece and you would like to organize something in Athens as well, we would be very honored. You know, just think about it. Thank you very much.
Have a good summer. Thank you.
Have a good summer, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Have a good one.
Have
Thank
a
you so
good
much.
summer.
Bye.
Thank you, Herr Lambert. Bye-bye.